Okay, we are live. Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best contributors to our independent policy movement for progress to bring power to the people. With me today, we have Evan Marcourt, a member of the Hill of Roses team, who will be covering a variety of topics for us. But I think his main specialty and a piece that we're going to get to cover today is on foreign policy. Evan, welcome to the program.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me on. Excited to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to be able to talk to you. This is the first time you're on the program. Do you mind letting the folks out there, before we dive into your article, get to know yourself a little bit better, the subjects that you're covering, and, potentially one of the reasons you wanted to be able to join the Hill of Roses organization to be an advocate?
Yeah, so my name is Evan Marcourt. I'm a political science major at the University of Iowa currently. With the Hill of Roses, I'll be writing about foreign policy and democracy reform. And I'm also currently the secretary for the editorial board. And part of why I decided to join, or why I was interested in joining, was I've been interested in politics for 5 years, ever since the 2016 election. That's what sparks my interest. And I've always loved writing. And so if there is a way for me to keep writing about politics, get my thoughts out there, be able to contribute to moving the discussion forward in America, being the change that I want to see in the world, I'm all about that. So the Hill of Roses seemed like a great spot to do that.
Yeah, and we're really lucky to have you join to be able to bring your perspective to this organization. I think, frankly, this was a great first piece that I read. The title of the piece that you had written about was, the U.S.-China foreign policy crash course. And, some of the top 5 issues, in your opinion, of issues to monitor going forward. So I have to ask yourself, before we get into the contents of the article, I wanted to understand, in your opinion, why China was the first thing that you wanted to focus on in terms of foreign policy. There's so much of the world we could be covering and so many crises around the world. What made China the first place to start?
Yeah, so I wanted to write about a country that people were interested in. So I ran a Twitter poll on my Twitter account. I put 4 countries. I think it was China, Iraq, Afghanistan, and North Korea. And so I let the audience decide what country they wanted to read about. And China was in the lead with, I think, about 30 to 40% of the vote. So there was a range of, it wasn't a runaway by any means, but China was the first one that people wanted to hear about. And hopefully I can turn this into a series where I go country to country writing about a brief crash course of the history of the relations with the United States, and then 5 issues that are of interest today.
Yeah, I personally participated in your own poll as well, and I picked China myself. I love that you're kind of combining the ideas of foreign policy and democracy, letting the fans out there have a little bit of a say. So, when I read your piece, the basic summation of how you kind of covered it was you first wanted to cover why it was important. Then you dove a little bit into the history of the relationship that we've had with China, and then you focused on some of the modern problems. In your opinion, what do you think is our current state of relationships compared to potentially the past, when we made our first real major contact with them during the Nixon administration? Do you think our relationships with China have improved, or do you think that they've deteriorated, or is it about the same?
Well, the world's a very different place than it was in 1972 when Nixon first went to China. Back then, the Cold War we were in the midst of that. The Soviet Union was the evil empire, as Reagan said. There was 2 main, the United States and the Soviet Union. And then after the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States has kind of had free reign as the lone superpower in the world. And now, as we're moving into the 2020s, we're starting to see China creep back up and challenge the unipolarity that the United States has in the foreign policy, challenging us as the lone superpower. And I think we feel threatened by that, frankly. And we want to maintain our status, maintain our influence around the world, secure our economic interests, things like that. So I think our relationship with China has been getting more tense in recent years as China's economy is thriving, as they take on a greater role.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, I know it's become a little bit more tense, but do you think that this has the potential to ever boil over to a full-on engagement of military conflict? I think most people, when they've seen our relationship, it's been primarily driven by economics. But do you think we are at a stable point where military conflict is an unlikely consequence in that relationship?
Hopefully not. Hopefully, because that'd basically be World War III. But as of right now, I don't think there's any imminent concern about a full-on military confrontation with the United States and China. There are spots where we do have competing kind of military interests. North Korea, for example, Hong Kong, the South China Sea, various spots within that region where there are kind of military tensions. But I don't think we're near the point yet where we should be concerned about a full-blown war.
Mm. So in your opinion, we've clearly seen an economic development in China over the past couple of decades, but what have you seen, in your opinion, that's changed culturally? I know you mentioned our beginning of this relationship really came in part with the Cold War as well as general sentiments. And back then they had a pretty much dominant communist regime under Mao Zedong. Do you think that they are still a communist nation today? How would you define the economic and government model of China, in your opinion, today?
I wouldn't consider them communist today. Under Mao Zedong, when they started, they were definitely a communist country. But in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping became leader, he instituted a lot of free market reforms, opened China up to the global economy. And that's what that was a turning point in Chinese history. Was the turning point to flinging their economy into what it is today. Ever since 1978, their real annual GDP has grown by an average of 9.5% per year due to those free market reforms. But they're still being ruled by the Communist Party. Their current leader, Xi Jinping, has authoritarian tendencies that we haven't really seen with the past few leaders. So they're getting more. The authoritarian streak in China is definitely strengthening in recent times. But to call them a communist China or a communist country in practice, not really. More just their name at this point.
So, in your opinion, what is our biggest economic threat that China imposes on us? Why do you feel that America, despite, obviously China's been growing in its GDP, but what are the major competition points that you've seen in our relationship with China on an economic scale?
Mm-hmm. Definitely for the past about 30 years, manufacturing has been a huge issue. China, the world's factory, as many people call them, taken a ton of manufacturing jobs from all over the world. They became the hub of that. But I think as we move into this decade and beyond, I think the biggest economic issue, or I wouldn't say issue, but technology is going to be the big thing. China wants to be a global leader in artificial intelligence by 2030. Their 5G capabilities, 5G infrastructure building has been a point of recent controversy. Huawei under several regulations by the United States government. So I think technology is really the defining economic issue as we go forward. On the campaign trail, Andrew Yang often said that technology is the oil of the 21st century. And I found it was interesting while I was doing research for this article and stuff. The pivot to Asia from the United States foreign policy, it started under the Obama administration, talking about moving towards East Asia as a focus in our foreign policy instead of the Middle East. And everybody knows the Middle East has a lot of oil, and now East Asia is where technology is king. So I know Andrew Yang used it in different contexts, but the connection there I thought was interesting.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest developments that's been happening under the most recent administrations, both the Trump administration as well as the Obama administration, has been our relationship with China on a trade front. One of the biggest things that had happened under the Obama administration, as they were starting to, head out the door a little bit, was the idea of the TPP agreement, and this became a major point of negotiation, basically while on the campaign trail. People had to kind of have some flexibility. Hillary Clinton was one of the few who was championing the TPP. And then you had Bernie Sanders as well as Donald Trump on the campaign trail arguing against the TPP. Do you have any sentiments when it came to that TPP agreement and going forward, because we still have not signed into it? Do you think that's something that we should be considering?
Well, you got to weigh the cost, domestic consequences versus pull out. I'm not an expert specifically on that deal,
Sure.
but I know when Obama signed it, the idea behind it was reducing the dependency for those countries around China, giving the United States more of a stock in the Eastern Asian, kind of economy as well as all the other Pacific countries, because China is really the one superpower in that area. They have a lot of control over everything. And the United States was trying to chip into that a little bit, but I definitely think economic trade deals in that area, as long as they aren't hurting domestic jobs, industries in the United States, is something worth pursuing. I think it's definitely a worthwhile goal to help kind of increase parity in the region.
Yeah, I kind of agree with your general sentiment that we do need to put some economic presence there beyond just our current trade, relationships with those nations. We need to establish more of a free relationship in some of those areas with some obviously stipulations. I consider it kind of like a hybrid free trade, fair trade. We obviously are not trying to say we want tariffs in that region to try and balance the fairness of it. We just want certain common standards upheld if you are going to be a part of this trade bloc. But one of the big things that I had as a current concern with the TPP, which is why I'm kind of happy, at least in the form that it was proposed under the Obama administration, that it didn't pass, was some of the basic arbitration rules that allowed multinational corporations to have some authority over national laws to be able to supersede those things. So I think that was a good thing. But I think going forward, we still need to pursue such a deal, but without those stipulations in it, so that we have a little bit more national standards to be able to supersede these multinationals. The second biggest trade, occurrence that has happened, this has been a major thing under the Trump administration, was this trade war with China, with certain tariff policies imposed upon the nations. What is your general sentiment on the use of tariffs, and B, how have you evaluated this specific instance of going into a trade war with China? Do you think that was something that was smart or ill-advised from the Trump administration?
Well, the reasons that the Trump administration gave for going into the trade war were to cut back, or to kind of serve as a punishment or a deterrent for the unfair trade deals, tactics China's been using for years, intellectual property theft scandals, and that was the goal of the Trump administration. But as we've seen as a result, tariffs, they're felt by the consumer. So as Americans, we are negatively affected by the tariffs. American farmers have been hit. Recently, China has threatened to stop importing soybeans from the United States, although it seems that is more just a threat rather than something that will be happening in actuality. But still, the threat's always there now, and we'll see what becomes of it. It's calmed down a little bit due to the coronavirus, with basically all the whole economy kind of shutting down. But I think as soon as we can get out of the trade war, the better.
I generally agree with you, Evan. One of my basic philosophies to trade is, I'm not entirely opposed to some level of protectionism, but you have to be smart with what you're applying your tariffs to. One of the things that was, I think, a misstep from the Trump administration is that they applied these things to raw materials. And so this hurt a lot of our own manufacturing here that you steal as an input from China. If you're willing to do maybe some protective measures on final, like, consumable products, luxury goods, that's something I think we can discuss potentially doing. But, if one nation has a higher supply of something and therefore are able to produce it cheaper, I don't think we should be trying to start a trade war on that front and harming our own manufacturing capabilities here. I want to turn this to another point you had made in your 5 issues to watch. And I want to extrapolate a little bit upon it. You had mentioned in this, one of the big things to watch was Hong Kong, and how there's this basically independent state within China that has its own authority in judicial practices, that it's supposed to be able to have some sovereignty of its own, and that's being superseded currently by China. What do you think is the American role there? And then, I want to pivot after that to talk about general interventionism within the country, because they also have this Uyghur problem at first. But let's focus on Hong Kong now. What do you think America should be doing, if at all, regarding Hong Kong?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the United States is definitely in a precarious situation here. because over the last years, as you were saying, China has increasingly clamped down on Hong Kong. They used to be strictly two systems, one country, where Hong Kong had their own, government, their own judicial system, things like that. But within the past year now, on May 27th, Mike Pompeo said that Hong Kong had lost their autonomy and that, China had basically taken over them. And so that's something, you hate to see. The United States has said that they support Hong Kong all throughout this. But again, this is how far do we want to go towards risking full military conflicts with China? Because if we make too aggressive of a move, how will China respond? And although we do want to support democracies around the world, we also want to weigh that balance with risking a full-on military conflict. So it's a very, very difficult question what the United States should do, but I think we should try a lot of other tactics before we ever resort to the military.
Yeah, I think it is a particularly difficult situation, not only because of the power that China has in such a high population and its economic power in the surrounding region, but also because we don't even have the power to properly utilize some of our multilateral bodies. We couldn't just go to the UN and try and condemn them through a multilateral channel because China is on that board to be able to just shoot that down. So I think in general, what we need to be doing is working outside of this formal multilateral body and use some of our just general alliances as pressure, frankly, potentially using some economic means to do so. I think if the problem was that we were the only consumers that were being hit by this trade policy problem. But if China was being hit by many more countries where they're no longer having all that demand for those raw materials that were part of the trade war with them, maybe they are going to be able to budge a little bit quicker on some of these policies, because now it's not just one trade partner, but it's a multiple of trade partners. But now I wanted to turn to the second part, because, obviously the sovereignty of Hong Kong is one issue, and there's a lot of protests that are ongoing there, as we can kind of have some empathy with our own protest situation in the States. But do you think we have to be maybe even stronger when it comes to the Uyghur situation? Millions of Muslims currently being put into re-education camps, as they call them, to basically train them out of being part of the Muslim faith into a little bit more of a secular Chinese society. Do you think there's any difference there compared to the Hong Kong issue with how we handle it as a nation?
The Uyghur re-education camps are a blatant violation of human rights. What's going on there is terrible. Having, the Uyghur populations and other Muslims in that region being forced to basically undergo state indoctrination, strip them of their religion, bar religious practices. You see there's a lot of face scanning checkpoints in that region, really intrusive, mass government surveillance things. But again, it's that precarious situation. How far do we want to go? Obviously, what's going on is wrong. Hopefully, there could be some international cooperation, use our institutions that we've created to hopefully, put some pressure on China to reduce those policies. Going back to Hong Kong, that's being brought up as a negotiation leverage point in recent trade war talks, and you can expect that to be in the future. So if there's any way that sanctions, economic leverage, anything that the United States or international affairs have to help out the Uyghurs and other populations that are being affected in China, it's definitely something that should happen.
Yeah, I generally agree with that approach. Evan, just a moment away from China, I wanted to hear your general philosophy when it comes to interventionism types of policies, because I think some would say we only do intervention on these countries that we frankly have a little bit more of a dominant relationship to. It's not a little bit of an equal playing field like China. Let's say, for example, we were finding this in a smaller nation, these same types of issues. Do you think it would be appropriate in those cases to have a more military interventionist style, or are you more of an anti-interventionist yourself?
I would be anti-intervention if it was only the United States. I don't think we should serve as the policeman of the world. I don't think we should be going in and trying to fix everything as we see fit, especially when we have problems in our own country. That policeman of the world phrase is a little bit problematic right now. But I do think that I believe in using international institutions to try and combat some of these things. Obviously, violations of human rights are abhorrent. They should not happen. Everybody should stand against them. But in cases like China, if we go in, it might make things worse, or worse in a general sense. Like if we get thrown into war, if there's other things. So basically, the primary outlook should be what will we do to make the situation best, not necessarily acting purely based on emotions. What can we do to reduce the number of lives lost? What can we do to reduce the amount of harm in these re-education camps that are going on? So I don't know if that answers the question.
I think that provide a general philosophy to what you believe. The next thing I kind of wanted to focus on is this is a little bit similar to intervention in general. It's more the occupation of regions. And so one of the things that you had covered in your piece was looking out for the South China Sea as a potential hotbed. There being 7 countries that are touching the South China Sea, how there is a large oil supply within the region, and how China has been particularly aggressive in trying to seize territory within the South China Sea. Do you believe it is part of the role of the United States to try and occupy that region as like a deterrent and peacekeeping force? Or do you think that is an area where we should be withdrawing forces from?
I wouldn't use the word occupy, but I also wouldn't want to withdraw totally. I think we should kind of be there, just maintaining a presence, but nothing to escalate tensions, nothing to anything like that. Currently, China is advocating for a 9-dash line, for the world to acknowledge their 9-dash line, which basically gives them almost total control of the South China Sea. And they've been creating man-made islands for, I think, about 7 years now, trying to get through legal loopholes to claiming the waters. And so while we don't want to, occupy the South China Sea or take over, we also do have allies in the region who are also strongly reject China's claims, and we're looking to help them too. So I think as long as we're there helping our allies, not escalating anything on our own, I think that's a good thing. Because a third of the world's trade goes through the China Sea every year. There's tons of oil underneath it, tons of rich fishing waters, things like that. So if China gains sole control over that or gain more control, that would be bad for economic reasons, bad for everybody around the world. But you can't. I don't want to start a war for just purely economic reasons, something like that. I think as much peacefulness, as much diplomacy, a better word, as possible.
Yeah, so now I want to transition the conversation as we're going to wrap up a little bit to the future. So one of the things that you covered as a thing to watch is technology. And before in the interview, you had alluded to their presence in trying to invest into the AI space. But there are other technologies as well that they're looking to develop, whether it be 5G technologies, the development of semiconductors, and generally they have a strong manufacturing force within China. What do you think are some of the things that we need to be doing on a technology front to make sure that these technologies are being utilized like responsibly, because we've also been seeing a lot of intellectual property theft, and B, what do you think we need to be doing to compete better with China on those fronts?
Yeah, we definitely don't want to be losing the race for technology here. As the future goes on, whoever controls AI or whoever has a lead in that will have significant advantages, both economically and military, throughout the world, being able to make new military technology as well as being able to sell that around the world. So investing heavily, promoting, engineering, all sorts of computer science programs, things like that. Throughout the past 20 years, we've seen technology be kind of a democratizer. We've seen with the Arab Spring, stuff like that, technology being used to help spread democracy, help alleviate poverty, things like that. But it's interesting, we might be at kind of a tipping point for that, as China's been using technology for government crackdowning, government surveillance purposes, things like that. Some estimate as many as 500 million surveillance cameras are in China right now. So we want to be, I guess I got a little bit off topic there, but as much as we can continue to advance our artificial intelligence and 5G capabilities, move into this decade full-fledged ahead. Yeah.
So I guess the next thing that I wanted to know is, we have a very interlocked relationship with China. I'd say a very large part of our general supply chain has come through China, and that left us vulnerable in times of crisis like we've had with the coronavirus, not just because we had a lot of goods needing to flow in from China, which gave us exposure to the virus, but the basic supply chain for getting goods to consumers and being able to make sure that we can just sustain ourselves when we had to be a little bit more isolated really exposed a weakness of ours. What do you think is that ongoing relationship we need to be having in terms of a supply chain with China and other nations in general?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the world is globalized to a point where there's no going back. As free trade is definitely a priority. As much interconnection, keep the money flowing around the world. Hopefully the coronavirus, hopefully that can get under control. Hopefully a vaccine gets found here soon where something like this problem will kind of go away. But, we do need China. It's not like we can just shun them, raise tariffs on them forever. Mm-hmm. They do have 15% of the world's GDP total economy, so it's not like we can avoid them. They're not going away, and neither is the United States. So as much as we can do to better our relations with them, hopefully turn them in the direction of not violating human rights and like not clamping down on Hong Kong, things like that. But it's definitely a very precarious situation, probably the country where our foreign policy is most important looking into the future as far as total world repercussions and how the United States will move forward as a country.
Mm-hmm. So the last thing that I would love for you to be able to address is I've heard from some people that our concerns over China are a little bit overblown, only because, yes, they were this rapidly growing economic country, but now we've been seeing in their own policies a cause of an aging population, in large part due to the one-child policy within China. And this has caused some general stagnation for the country of China. Do you think that we need to be hyper-focused on China going forward in terms of economic competition, or do you think they're going to be generally just continuing this stagnation? Do you have general sentiments for those that say this concern is a little bit overblown?
I wouldn't say hyper-focused, but I do support the kind of sentiment behind the pivot to Asia, paying more attention to China. Yes, the one-child policy has created kind of an age dependency that's about to, they're about to feel its full effects with that. But, their government is very ambitious and they make a lot of bold claims. So as they continue to move forward, these big projects that they plan, these big state sanctioned projects, I don't think, counting them out or saying that, we shouldn't be focused on them. I think they are clearly the biggest competition the United States has economically around the world. And I do think they should be the focus of our foreign policy into the next 10 years. It's a country we don't want to mess up. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair statement. So, Evan, I wanted to thank you so much for being able to cover this article with us today, as well as just generally writing as well. People can find it at thehillofroses.com. The title of the article is U.S.-China Foreign Policy Crash Course and 5 Issues to Watch Moving Forward. Evan, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with the audience when it comes to China or your coverage of issues going forward in terms of the foreign policy space?
Be on the lookout for my next poll that I'll have out. I'll have 4 options again for which country I'll be writing on. So if you want to help, decide what you want to read, follow me on Twitter. It's just at my name, at Evan Marquardt. And thank you for having me on. This was a good discussion. So thank you.
You're very welcome, Evan, and we're really glad to be able to have you on this network because I think, frankly, this was a very detailed article. I loved how you presented it and why we should care, what is our history, and then what do we need to be looking going forward. So I highly recommend anyone share this video. That'll be coupled with that article as well with their friends if they're just not understanding of why specifically there's so much concern around China. So thank you so much, Evan, once again. And we look forward to seeing all your work to come. We're really glad to have you as part of this organization and seeing you step up into leadership roles within it.
Thank you. I'm excited to keep writing.
Yeah. And so, Rosebuds, the last thing that I want to leave you with is some of our upcoming content here at the Hill of Roses. We're going to be having a really exciting upcoming couple of weeks, but I'll just lay out the lay of the land of what we have this upcoming week. You know, if you missed it already, we had our 21st Century People Powered Government event this past Sunday, yesterday. So if you have not seen that yet and you have a good amount of time on your hands, I highly recommend you check out that recap that we posted on the website. Otherwise, upcoming this week, we have an interview tomorrow with Antoine Pierce. He's a U.S. Senate candidate from Louisiana, a candidate who has been endorsed by Andrew Yang himself. So he'll be a very interesting interview to hear. Then we'll be having Corey Strong, a candidate from Tennessee's 9th District, coming onto the program to be able to speak with us. Then we will be having on the 18th, Isan Leckie. She's a candidate from Massachusetts' 4th District. And then on Friday, we're going to be having on the Green Party presidential and vice presidential candidates, Howie Hawkins and Angela Walker. So we have a really jam-packed schedule this week. So once again, we'll thank Evan for having been here. He's now off, but we're really thankful he came on to be able to talk today. And as always, my friends, I hope you're staying safe out there. And as always, I hope you're staying rosy.